Welcome, everybody. This is our fourth in a series of we don't know how many because we don't know how long this thing is going to last. Thursdays at noon, where we do a little bit of reading, political reading, and then we come together and somebody leads a short discussion and we have a discussion with one another about the reading. And so it's really nice to have everybody back. If this is your first time here, welcome. The previous readings are on the invitation that Julie sends out every week, and she also puts the past discussions on YouTube. So if anybody wants to catch up with some of the previous ones or review them, they're welcome to do that. We've really been having a discussion about what organizing needs to look like at a moment when globalization and some of the other things that we've been victims to, in a way, are questionable, are being questioned rather. And we started off with an article that Morris wrote in the New Statesman, and from there we had a discussion, couple discussions on work, including a piece from Alinsky. We took a look at Polanyi and his notion of the commodification of work. And then today we're going to be treated to a discussion of some theological understanding of work led by Kathleen O'Toole. To do a short review, I'm going to ask Morris if he'll do that. So Lord Glassman, could you do a short review for us? And if you want to make sure that you're getting the emails because somebody else invited you to this and you're not sure you're getting the emails, make sure you put that in the chat and Julie will take a look at those emails and we can keep expanding our email list.
Okay, so I think I better put my glasses on to look respectable and really good to see you all again. So essentially the way I'm viewing this is that we need to renew organising. We need to get our heads around what we're doing and somehow reconcile place-based organising, faith-based organising with work and work-based and bring that together in a kind of parallel politics that can hold the powers of capital and the administrative state to account. And this looks like it's a good moment to rethink all that. So essentially, just to recap, I think with COVID or coronavirus, we're just living through an intensification and concentration of the previous 12 years. To summarize the features of the new era, the era that is to come, so it's relevant to talk about Pope Francis, I think, with Kathleen speaking, is Pope Francis said last November or so, he said, we're not living through an era of change, but a change of era. So what are the features of this new era? And the first is that politics is back. That manifests itself in the primacy or the greater importance of the nation state. The era we're moving from is progressive globalization or liberal globalization, whichever way you want to put it, in which the middle class, the capital subordinated labor, the middle class were definitely much more important than the working class. Those were the features. The place was kind of eviscerated and the places that people lived were called, what were they called? Flyover country, the left behind, known to academics, of which I am one, as God-forsaken. If you got a job in one of those places, it was a God-forsaken place. And in which rights certainly subordinated democracy. So that's the era that we lived through, and we all lived through it. But what's emerging now is possibly a different era. So the first is a much more important role for the nation state. The second is a much more important role and respect for working people, for the working class. Old concept, so new definition of the working class, everybody, something you can't do from home. So there's one way of conceiving of it, that you have to go out and do something for other people, usually involving your hands. And the third feature of the new era is suddenly the place is important, and the places where people live. People are talking about industrial strategy, they're talking about a renewal of agriculture, farming. So in the story that I'm telling, there's a moment coming, and the moment is coming where all of these things will be besieged by the demand of capital to reassert its, to reassert its profit, to recoup its losses, which could disintegrate. So the relationships that we make now are really important. And so essentially, reflecting on what you're doing as organizers, you're essentially asserting that human beings are social beings, that they can build their power through relationships and defy the power of capital, and also hold the power of the state to administer and to dominate, to account. So that's what we do. So we looked at that. We looked at Polanyi, very crucial part of this story, about the Great Transformation and the logic of commodification. And what is being commodified? Creation itself, human beings and nature have to be subordinated to fluctuating markets. And then what happens? People just turn to the state, and that's his explanation of the rise of fascism. So we're essentially defending the institutional integrity of society against its domination by the state and the market. And then we looked at Alinsky and the sit-down strike, and there were many aspects of the organizing there. The power analysis came in, the holding politicians to account, and being able, through the power of a shared story and relationships, to defy the might of General Motors. And it just so central to this, going back to the back of yards and the meat packing plants, was the alliance with the Catholic Church, and particularly with Catholic social thought, which is a fundamental thing. And in Catholic social thought, there is the idea that the human being is threatened with dehumanization from this rerum novarum, this new thing, which is capitalism, and also by a desacralized administrative state that just wishes to control and administer people. And the redemption comes through association, a variety of associations, but particularly between faith and labor. I won't say any more because I could speak all day, but that's how I'm viewing this work, is an act of retrieval and renewal so that we can act effectively in the new era when COVID lifts, to defy the dominion of money and to actually assert the integrity of relationships and institutions in building an alternative politics. Jonathan, is that acceptable?
It's very good, thank you.
Okay.
We asked, back in 1992, the Industrial Areas Foundation invited me to Baltimore to work on the issue of work and wages with the BUILD organization. And BUILD at the time had a wonderful lead organizer who was rebuilding the organization. And Arnie Graff suggested that Kathleen O'Toole and myself be co-lead organizers. Now, this was unheard of in the IAF. And it was a really bad idea, everybody thought, because how could two people get along being co-lead organizers in one project, and two projects really in one city? But it turned out to be a total delight. And it's one of the highlights of my career, is the few years that Kathleen O'Toole and myself co-organized in Baltimore in the living wage and in the reorganization of the BUILD organization. And part of that work was to really work inside of the church around the whole question of work, because we knew we wanted to do some organizing around work. And there had been a very tentative, and, well, tentative is not the right word, tense relationship between BUILD and the local labor unions in the city going on for a number of years. So we didn't start at zero, we started below zero in people's, inside the church's, understanding of labor organizing. Plus there was this history, and the history was a history of African Americans being systematically pushed out of or kept from joining, especially the building trade unions in the city. And there was a long history of that. So we didn't start at zero. And so we needed to start with really understanding the kind of organizing we wanted to do. And we called on Leo Penta, and Kathleen took a leading role in this. And we began an internal discussion among the clergy and laity on reading and reflecting. And that's why we asked Kathleen if she would talk about the papal encyclical, which we used quite extensively at the time to try to understand the work we were about to do. So Kathleen, thank you for leading this.
Thanks, Jonathan. I am delighted to see a half dozen or so very familiar faces. We've all aged a bit. Some of you haven't seen me with my full white. And I'm aware, both in the documents that we're talking about, of the what's being pulled from a past that's, at least in the case of the encyclical, 30 years ago, but that I'm speaking to people who may have different levels of knowledge or exposure to Catholic social teaching and all of this stuff. But I want to preface this by saying, when Jonathan caught me on the phone last week on my way out to spend Mother's Day with my 92-year-old mom and asked me if I would do this, my first thought was, would I rather be reading poetry, Seamus Heaney in specific, Martin, or would I like to spend some time this weekend reading the Pope's encyclicals? I would say that it was only the prospect of seeing your faces and Jonathan's charm that even got me to think about it. But frankly, the reason I said yes is that it really took me back to the beginnings of my public life in 1975, when I agreed to step unknown into this community organizing world because of a Catholic Monsignor in Wilmington, Delaware, Monsignor Tom Reese. And I realized that in those first years, in the pre-IAF, 12 years of wandering in the desert or whatever it was, that I was surrounded by a generation of Catholic leaders, many of them priests, but also lay leaders, people like Tom Reese and Jack Egan and Tom Gaudet in Chicago, who were steeped in these documents, that they lived and breathed Catholic social teaching and knew these documents inside out through things like the Catholic Christian Family Movement, Catholic Family Movement, and Young Workers, and all of those mediating organizations within the Catholic world that lived and breathed these documents. And so I felt like, for that reason, I needed, in gratitude to them and to honor the people that formed me, I ought to do this. And so what I'm hoping to do, and I should say, the other part of that, and the reason I threw a poem in there from Phil Levine, and I'm grateful to Patty for adding another one, is that I know that those people who formed me had both the moral authority and moral imagination of the Catholic social teaching, and they were deeply relational and knew the stories of the people they were working with. And so we need to bring both of those into this discussion. So what I'm hoping to do is a few comments for those that may not know or have forgotten the context of Catholic social teaching into which Pope John Paul II stepped when he wrote this encyclical in 1981. A few comments on that, a few comments on him and the context he was acting out of, and then 3 or 4 reflections that I have on the document, noting that I didn't have you read the whole thing. It was tough enough to get through 20 pages, let alone 40. But I want to lift out some things that I think are particularly important to us in this moment about what the documents are saying. And then I really want to open it up to you, and specifically to get your reactions, what was surprising, what felt really fresh and, and current in terms of our moment, and the questions that it raises for you in the context of what Morris introduced. So I want to note that Jonathan and Morris and company, Leo and Ben, couldn't have picked a more appropriate date, since this encyclical was intended to have been made public on the 15th of May in 1981, which would have been the 90th anniversary of the first papal encyclical, except that the Pope was shot on the 13th of May. There was an attempt to assassinate him, and therefore he wasn't able to deliver this encyclical until the following September. So we are at an appropriate moment. Tomorrow's the 130th anniversary of the first papal encyclical that forms the body of Catholic social teaching. And the Pope refers to it in the beginning of Laborem Exercens. Leo will correct my Latin pronunciation later. But Rerum Novarum, which was delivered by Leo XIII in 1891, really led to this whole series of papal encyclicals that we refer to as Catholic social teaching. I'm looking at Joe Morris. I'm sure you've heard a lot of these things because Leo XIII is always referred to as the labor pope because of this one encyclical. And we can talk about the world as it is that he was speaking out of, and a century of class struggle and the emergence of Marxist socialist thought. And there are a lot of reasons that he wrote this encyclical, but its significance, Rerum Novarum, of new things, which, as Morris said, was industrial capitalism, I guess that summarizes it, is that he named the rights of workers to organize, the rights of workers to strike, and he, named the dignity of work. And actually, in the language of the 1891 encyclical, really laid the foundation for what we now know as, or the Catholic Church refers to as, a preferential option for the poor, because he lifted up the words of solidarity that we now see throughout Catholic social teaching emerged later, but he named the special place that people who are poor and marginalized have in Catholic social thought. So that encyclical was what this Pope, John Paul II, was honoring by writing Laborem Exercens in 1981. I think maybe for my generation of Catholics and people, I'm looking around the circle, Larry and others. I think Matt McDermott, who else, Martin, we look at John Paul II maybe in terms of his more conservative legacy in the church, and we can easily forget who he was and when he was writing. That this encyclical was written by a Polish pope in 1981. And he had been a supporter of the Solidarity Workers movement in Poland as a bishop and as pope. And the takeover of the Gdańsk shipyard had happened a year earlier. And so there was a context in which this encyclical was written. And he, went on to be very much both an anti-communist, but a supporter of labor and labor movements in, what would later, lead to the fall of the Berlin Wall and all of that. So, so that's the context in which this encyclical was written. I guess one of the things I want to say about the intervening years of Catholic social thought, because if you read those first 4 pages, the introduction, he alludes to that. And I think what really developed in the interim, always in reaction to what was going on in society, the Pope Pius XI wrote an encyclical coming out of the Depression. And then John 23rd, I think the significant thing that emerged with Vatican II and the social, the documents, not only written by a pope, but written through the process of the Second Vatican Council, is that they were no longer just speaking to Catholics, but speaking to the world. And I think that was pretty explicit in the social documents of the Vatican Council. Not only were they speaking to the world in terms of the global economy and the situation of the poor, and that concept of solidarity becomes very robust coming out of Vatican II. But I think, the ambition of the Catholic Church, my old mentor, Tom Gaudet, used to say the genius of the Catholic Church was to divide the entire world into parishes, focusing on that idea of place, Morris, that you lifted up. But the other thing was the hubris, really, of we're speaking to the world. This is not just about Catholics anymore. And these principles that we're laying out come out of our biblical understanding, but we are speaking with a megaphone, to the church writ large and the world. And that, I think, was part of the tone and ambition of the documents of the Second Vatican Council. Some of you, this is old, old news to you, but I figured for all of us, we ought to refresh our memory on those things. Before I talk a little bit about 3 or 4 things that I want to lift up in the document, I'm just going to say a word about language. I need to, it is hard to get through a document where every other word is man. And I only have to think about how I love Thomas Merton and the pills I have to take to read it in the original, because nobody has yet done that I know of, an inclusive language version of Thomas Merton, which died in 1968. So I just want to say that. So several things I want to lift up in the document. One, just from the get-go, and the reason that I wanted you to read the first 4 or 5 pages is the extent to which from the beginning he lifts up the paradox in work, that it is both a source of dignity for the human person and, I'm quoting now, the unceasing measure of human toil and suffering, that those 2 things are embodied together in work, I guess, both in the biblical understanding of that, if you want to go there, but also the reality of work in the world as it is. But also, and I think there's some quotes on page 3 that are particularly powerful, that from the beginning, when he notes the suffering and implicit in work, that there is an agency of the church writ large, that it is the task and the role of the church to, I'm quoting, call attention to the dignity and rights of those who work and condemn situations in which that dignity and those rights are violated, and to help guide the changes as to ensure authentic process by humans and society. That could have been the mission statement for the Living Wage campaign. And it was always that moral authority and imperative that we were after in using these documents. That there is a whole middle section of this document that I didn't have you read because it's a slog. But this whole discussion, which in the Pope's language, between the subjective and not objective role of work, is really this argument against the commodification of work. I see you nodding, Morris. That's what, it was tough for me to get through the language of it, but that's what he is really arguing strongly. And I frankly think that's where the 2 poems come in, that they're arguing the opposite, which is that it is the soul part of work that cannot be ignored, and that the modification of the worker drives the creativity and the soul and the dignity out of work. And that's really what the Pope is arguing really strongly here, is for work, the subjectivity, and against, what he calls the economization. And you don't need to get into his whole, argument about that. And then the other thing that I think is really key that he hammers home here is this idea of the state as the indirect employer, and therefore that the state must conduct just labor policy, that there is a role to play. Clearly, he was also arguing against state socialism. That's where it was coming from, but that he does not minimize the role that the state must play in ensuring that policies are developed that make sure that there's, justice. And he does argue pretty forcefully against the maximization of profit that's implicit in capitalism, and that leads to the commodification of work. And so for me, those were the real, that was the meat of this that was really important in 1992, 93 when we were organizing in Baltimore, and I think is really important now. One story, or 1.5 stories, and then I'm going to open it up. The place where I saw these documents intersect most powerfully with our organizing, and I was reminded of this reading an academic document that just came out after many of us were interviewed over many years, reflecting on the living wage moment in Baltimore. On Pentecost Sunday in 1993, there was an action where we launched the Solidarity Sponsoring Committee, the workers' organization that Jonathan came to Baltimore to Build as an experiment. And setting the scene for that, we were in a Presbyterian church on the east side of Baltimore, and there were probably 400 Build members in the sanctuary. And we opened the doors, and 100 workers who we'd met on the streets of Baltimore and in the hotels and in the custodian, the places where they were cleaning schools, walked in and were welcomed, embraced, recognized by Build and by the president of AFSCME and the auxiliary bishop of Baltimore. And there were two moments that I remember about that action. One was the moment when these still unorganized but previously unrecognized workers walked into the room and were welcomed by the Build organization. And the other was when this, I'm marking my words carefully, soft-spoken, bureaucratic auxiliary bishop of Baltimore was on fire preaching these documents. That those documents and their moral imperative came alive in this man, not just because of what they gave him in terms of moral authority, but because we'd been out for 6 months hearing, collecting, and bringing back to church leaders the stories of Blacka Wright and Valerie Bell and Charles Johnson and Renee Brown, who were, as I said, cleaning school buildings and hotels, and who put a face on low-wage work in Baltimore. And we were bringing those, the clergy and the organizers and leaders of Build were hearing those stories, and he brought the moral imperative of the church and lit fire, I have to say, a lot better than the president of AFSCME in that moment for our constituents. And then the months, Jonathan alluded to this, the months of study that we did with clergy who were very comfortable preaching the gospel on all of the issues that we had dealt with, but didn't feel like they could sufficiently address the issues of labor and job markets and commodification, and the dignity part they got, but the understanding of what, you know, these things that you're reading brought to them about the economics of work was what we worked on with these documents, and a lot of help from our friends. And so this, you know, became the platform on which, you know, we began to organize the living wage in Baltimore. So I guess I just want to open it up to you all. I'm not watching the chat carefully. I think some questions are coming up here, but we'd like to hear what you reacted to strongly. What were the things that were most relevant, and how do you think it speaks in this moment? I'll stop there.
My name is John Chrysavgis. I'm a clergyman of the Greek Orthodox Church. Work directly and very closely with the Ecumenical Patriarch in Istanbul. And I was responsible for a small group in our church that put together a social document that's just been posted actually in the last month or two. I'm interested in hearing from Kathleen, not so much the good news, if you like, of whether rerum novarum or laborem exercens, which I love very much, but what the reception of these documents are in the Catholic corporate, say, world. What sort of opposition do you see in the broader Catholic Church, in society or in the workplace?
I'll speak to part of this, and then I'll invite others in. My last gig, the last full-time job that I had after leaving the IAF was with Catholic Relief Services. And what I will say, what I guess I can speak to, is that there is a small and dedicated cadre of workers in the vineyard, I'm going to say. They're the folks in the Catholic institutions of social welfare, if you want to call them that, the international relief agencies, the Catholic charities, all of those people who are dealing with poor and marginalized folks around the world who embrace these social documents. I do not see it alive in the clergy in the way that it was when I first came into organizing. Leo, others can speak to this. Those of you who are on the ground, there just aren't the numbers of on the ground leaders, parish leaders. There are efforts to try to do that in the seminaries. I was involved in one of them when I was at Catholic Relief Services. But in fact, there's somebody who's an IAF leader of long, long ago. God, I'm going to forget his name. He's the chair of Ernie Cortez's board in Texas. One of my colleagues who's a priest that came up through COPS, who's out there through Catholic Relief Services trying to teach seminarians about Catholic social teaching. And there are like 3 seminaries in the country, or maybe 9, who are doing that, but it is not out there in the way it was in the immediate post-Vatican II era. And so part of it, I want to say that's partly, we got to do some of that. And I'm not saying just in the church. That is, I think, something Morris pointed out to me yesterday. We've got to see these documents not just as a way to, wake up the Catholic Church, but what is the, I raised the question to my colleagues when we were talking about this, how do we, whether it's with these or other forms of how do we wake up the moral imagination, not only of the church, but of the people of goodwill and institutions and associations that we're working with? We don't have the kind of broad consensus. And I guess, yes, there is active opposition. There are people out there hammering the folks who are speaking out of the, the Catholic social teaching because of the polarized politics of our country. But I don't think that can delay or distract us. It ought to motivate us to be out there making the argument. Anybody else?
I have a question from Adrienne McCauley.
Hi, Kathleen. Not so much of a question, a real intense reaction. One, I grew up in rural Arizona where my church was really stuck in Vatican II. Any technology that came to more urban communities in the rural world, like the church was in another era, which was great because it helped form me. But I would say, this has been one of the most frustrating things for me in my adulthood in organizing, is meeting with Catholics who have no understanding or anything about any of these documents. So just kind of airing out like my frustration. I like the idea of an opportunity to speak more broadly and not get depressed by trying to speak to the same crowd, thinking about using it in a different context. And then I just wanted to say the exercise around reading the poetry and the visualization paired with this, I think is something that could be really useful in the age of Zoom, to do more with our leaders and thinking about how do we move forward in different campaigns, and inspire clergy people or other leaders to do different homilies that aren't just about COVID-19 at this time. So just for me personally, like the visualization was incredibly useful on a personal level. And I think we need to do more of that.
Well, I will just say this, that part of what I had in mind when I sent that also very old poem, because it was written, that book was published in 1989. We actually did an organizer, reflection on that book of poems while we were doing the Living Wage campaign. But it seems to me that whether it's a poem or even more powerfully, how do you tell the stories of work now? I sent that poem intentionally because the title is What Work Is, and as an agitational invitation to you all to actually write what you're seeing now. What are the embodied stories of what work is? I have been agitated and moved by stories from Chris de la Cruz, one of our IAF leaders in Queens, who's a member of Patrick O'Connor's church, who's been telling the stories on Facebook mainly of the healthcare workers in their congregation, and he was quarantined at home with COVID-19. How do we tell and become a microphone for the stories of what is going on with workers now that make it actionable and that are informed not only by the moral imagination and imperative of these kind of documents, but the economic understanding that you guys are trying to form by doing this reading? That's really a challenge. And, you know, and run the action back on not only the religious institutions, but who else needs to stand in the gap with these, as Morris says, how work and the worker are being foregrounded at this moment. Thanks, Adrian.
Reverend Gideon.
By the way,
Good
it's Father
afternoon, and
David
thank you for,
Garcia is the
allowing
person
me.
I was trying to think of. Okay, you know him, Adrian, right? Okay, go ahead.
Kathleen, wonderful, wonderful readings today, and thank you for allowing me to ask this question. I guess I wonder, as we continue in conversation around these issues, if there isn't an opportunity to talk about how the kind of human development agenda and the dignity of work interacts with an environmental agenda that is sometimes seen in conflict with the sort of human development agenda, and also if there's not something to be said about the growing mechanization of labor and the dignity of work and the human role in labor, that I wonder if there were readings yet to come on these topics. And I wondered if our Greek Orthodox colleague has anything to say about the environmental agenda, which is sometimes seen in conflict with the human development agenda. I know that's not really a question, but it's sort of a extrapolation.
Father John, why don't you reply to that?
I would say what Kathleen just said, that there is a small remnant, there's a small group that tries to raise these issues in light of the scriptural, but also the sort of classical, sort of traditional writings of the Eastern Church, to highlight sort of some of these paradoxes. But there's a lot of opposition there, and especially among the clergy. That's why what I heard from Kathleen was actually not bad news for me. It was sort of encouraging that we're not alone, and also that that hubris she talked about, which is just who you're speaking to, that it should be that the more open, the broader the vision of what we address, the more likely that we can find, first of all, more support, but also that we can make more of a difference. If we're just focusing on Greek Orthodox, many of whom are, pretty affluent, if not influential, business leaders who resist the sort of vision that Patriarch Bartholomew has on the environment. We found that the more open our vision is, the greater the chances of raising awareness and mobilizing people. For instance, the Patriarch's been speaking about the environment since, the late 80s. But his close cooperation, and more than that, his close friendship with Pope Francis has made a difference in terms of getting his vision out there. And that's I think, a good thing. That's what dialogue is all about. It's reaching out beyond our comfort zones, beyond our own immediate sort of constituents. I remember when we began our work 3 years ago with this social document, that was the first question we asked ourselves, and then we asked the Patriarch, who are we addressing this to? Is this just something for our parishes. And if it is, well, how sad if that's the, limited vision that we have. So we found that looking as broadly as we can makes the bigger and the better difference.
I just want to highlight for you, I think everybody knows that, that this Pope not only echoed the economic arguments that are in this encyclical we're reading now, but that his main social encyclical was on creation, right? Laudato Si was on the connection of care for creation to the justice issues, and there's a connection to work, right? I mean, there's even a hint of it at the end of this very old encyclical that we're talking about creation, not only the creative instinct in the worker, but the resources and materials that are used in work. Jonathan, this might be a time, Morris, you actually interacted with the current Pope around these issues. Maybe you need to, he's got an insight from that too, yeah?
Yeah. So yeah, this is the fundamental thing, I think, before I get to my anecdote, is that capitalism wishes to commodify creation itself. That's human beings and nature. And so in a way, I see our place-based organizing as embedded in place and relating to nature. So it's just to bring the encompassing threat. And what's going to be happening in a few weeks when lockdown ends is that threat will be coming to an area near you. It's going to come in and it's going to be brutal. Yeah, so I was invited, I think what you're saying is I was invited actually by Pope Benedict. And then in the meantime, this Argentinian guy got the gig. So I thought it might be cancelled. I was invited to speak to the Vatican. It was precisely on Catholic social thought. And it was a very strange scene because I was speaking. It was, if any of you know Italy, the worst time to ever speak is late on a Friday afternoon because everybody wants to be out of Rome and at home. Anyway, they invited me to give this keynote speech, and there was these cardinals and there were these bishops and there was this unknown guy wearing white in the middle. And I gave this talk on Catholic social thought, which would be very close to what Kathleen said, very close to what that essentially the European Union was completely committed to capitalism, that, they'd lost workers, they'd lost farmers, and tried to speak about politics. And I gave the talk and there was this silence. And then, a cardinal from Milan stood up and said, "Yes, I think this is faithful to Catholic social thought." And he sat down. And then a cardinal from Chicago stood up and just said, "There's a word for this," he said, "and it's called communism." It was
Francis George.
It was a moment. He said, "What are you trying to do? Interfere with management's right to manage? What are you trying to do? Lay down the law to the market of what they've got to do?" And then a very sweet sort of another Italian, a Franciscan, stood up and said, "No, I think that this could be said to do, that this was okay." And then a Spanish cardinal stood up and basically reiterated the communist thing. So there we were, and the whole room. The interesting thing about the story is no one knew at this point what Pope Francis thought. The new boss was sitting there, and he was just sitting there, and he stood up and he turned around to the American cardinal and he said, "What's your idea? Cosa la tua idea?" He said in Italian to this guy. He said that you starve the parents and that you give the children pencils at school. Like, it was a complete straight attack on corporate social responsibility and the idea of private sector charity. He said, this is it. He just said, this is what we say. He said that this is a threat to the integrity of human life, and this is a threat to the integrity of the environment. And the answer is not state, but intensification of association, was the phrase he used in Italian. So that was an unusual, you know, so it was very odd experience, you know, to sort of be a bit player in what was obviously a quite important shift of tone within that. But it's been a very good, let's say, a very good relationship since then. But that's the issue. Well, I noticed 3 reflections. First is that in American Catholicism, there was a McCarthyism, you know, that there was something happened that shifted it away from what in Laborem Exercens, there's this fantastic phrase where he talks about capitalism having a structure of sin. In other words, that there's an internal thing going on, which is this commodification, which is this reward for vice, which is this maximization of profits. If you look at American markets, you'll see that any company that contracted out its workers when labor light was absolutely rewarded with investment. This is the story right across the board. So, you know, the structure of sin is really important to reflect on. So I think something went on in America within the church that really saw any criticism of capitalism as essentially a radical form of liberal socialism and you know, brought in the order of statism. I think that's the case. But the fundamental thing for us to bear in mind on what Kathleen's saying is that this work is absolutely central to how to conceptualize association as a means of resistance to domination. And what is being resisted is the desacralization of the human being and their natural environment. It's a really straight, so it's very complicated, but it isn't. It's really straight. It's the creation itself is what's being targeted here. And human beings as social beings have the capacity for love and association. And that seems to me to be a very good description of what organizing tries to preserve and to nurture between people.
Thanks very much, Kathleen. I just want to try to take it a little bit more out of the narrower church context. I think we've gotten a little bit into a kind of a narrow church discussion. And I want to go back to what you said at the beginning, and which is very clear in this encyclical, the addressees are much wider. And I think the other thing that I'd like to just lift up a little bit and see what you might say about that, but I mean, it was implicit in your stories. It's not just the dignity of labor itself, especially in the suffering phase of labor, if you will. It's about how labor becomes political. And we talked about this last week, and I think it should be a kind of a topic going forward. Association means labor becomes political, and it's not in virtue so much of the work that people do that they are political. It's when they begin to associate with each other, whether it's at a workplace or whether it's beyond one or more workplaces, that this thing becomes political. And I think that's why I think it's important to keep that in mind, that it's not just labor itself that is somehow, because of its dignity and its co-creative capacity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but because working people then add another dimension and become political. That's why I like to suggest we read Hannah Arendt next week, but we can argue about that later.
The only thing I want to keep this short so other people get in, but yes, absolutely. And when I forget the academic's name who just recently wrote a piece on the living wage movement, what was the most powerful for me reading our own history now in 2020 was how much that Ernie Cortez used to talk about organizing as the University of Public Life, right? The political formation of the worker leaders of Solidarity, who were named and whose stories were told, along with build leaders who I hadn't thought of in years, like Rose Butler, who was a fierce Catholic leader who led that action where we welcomed and so there was a political formation going on in both the clergy and lay leaders of Build in internalizing this understanding of the terms we're using now, the commodification of work, and not just the de-dignification, which of course was happening. And I remember conservative clergy like Bob Benke and Missouri Synod Lutheran and Roger Gensch, who is, God love him, in his academic, you know, I mean, they got taken to the streets into the stories of these workers and then politicized by what we were reading and thinking about, and the actions. You know, there probably were 10, you know, public actions that happened before that one that I described, where we brought the beginning, you know, organization of workers into the Build Collective. So it was all of that, the political formation process, and as you say, the politicization of labor, you know, bringing it into the power arena that was significant.
Hi, everyone. Kathleen, it's great to see you. I'm Rob English with Metro IAF, and most of my time in the IAF has been in Baltimore. So I just want to first thank Kathleen and Jonathan and Rose Butler and Valerie Bell and Reverend Vernon Dobson and Bishop Miles, and the list can go on. But all that work that has been doing in Baltimore since the early 90s was built off of all the good work that you all did. And Kathleen, I haven't looked at this reading for quite a long time. And when we think about political formation, what stood out to me in the article, one element was this idea, Morris, that you lifted up as the indirect employer. And you said it through the state. And when I read that, I challenged myself to think about, aren't we all indirect employers? So the question is, if you think about the three sectors of society, what does it mean to be in right relationship with those that are using their hands, those that are working? And as this economy reopens, God forbid, and you know, more workers are put at risk, we're the indirect employer. This is us. And Kathleen, I agitated me to think about all those stories that were heard of us as Build being in the streets and listening to the workers' stories, to Valerie Bell's story, and how that radicalized us. And that's Joe Morris in the chat had the same reaction of that term of the intensification of association. That's the organizing that, you know, at this particular moment we're called to do. And Kathleen, my question was, when you think about being the indirect employer, was there a story that stood out to you or Jonathan and the living wage that was a turning moment that moved the organization, given that we had, you know, particularly some conservative clergy, to stand up with workers?
Because you mentioned Vernon Dobson, the one that I thought of, I'm not sure that it was a story as much as a reaction, was that once workers began to engage and tell their stories publicly, when Valerie Bell was fired by her direct employer, which was a cleaning service, and Reverend Dobson, and eventually even Mayor Schmoke, who was reticent and timid, and I won't go into any other adjectives, that it made it absolutely clear the risk that workers were taking, and the fact that, you know, Reverend Dobson demanded that, I mean, what we used that reflection with the clergy with was to get them to acknowledge that they had to, you know, in your language, right, that it was us, that we were a part of this network of relationships, and we had to act to protect workers from retaliation. And that radicalized everybody, because they knew Valerie, they'd heard her story, and now she was being, you know, penalized, and, you know, and the mayor was forced to find her a job, a city job, you know, a full-time job. And that was a really radicalizing moment in that campaign.
Actually, in a way, the one that I think applies to what Rob is saying the best to me actually took place in London, where we were organizing in the national healthcare hospitals. And they had privatized, they had contracted out the cleaning services. And we were trying to negotiate, each of the hospitals has kind of a local board that helps control it. And we were trying to get recognition from that local board to negotiate a living wage for the cleaners in one of the East London hospitals. And we had had some success in the other hospitals, but this one hospital was just, Morris, you can remind me of the name of the hospital, Homerton or one of them.
It was the Royal London.
Yes, it was. And they wanted to go on a strike. And we decided, the group of us, the collective decided that before they would go on a strike, they needed to hold a community meeting, a meeting that we organized on the east side of town in one of the town halls over there. And the workers got up and asked the community for permission to strike. Now, these are the people who were cleaning the hospitals where their moms and their grandmas were in the hospital. And we were nervous about it. And they got up there one at a time and told the story of trying to get recognition and trying to get a living wage. And then we took a vote. And there were about 300 or 400 people in the room. And the vote wasn't quite unanimous. There were 3 or 4 people who voted no, but everybody but 3 or 4 voted to permit the strike and support the strike. So in other words, the community that used the NHS hospital actually voted. And I've never wept at one of my own actions, but I wept at that one. That one moved me, to watch the community vote to authorize a strike of the cleaners of their community hospital. I still get choked up when I think about it. It was so moving.
Yeah.
And part of my point is that, talk about 2 degrees of separation. I wonder how many of us, leaders, organizers, clergy, all of us, we are in fact employing in some way or another the very workers we're talking about with our moms and, relatives who are in home care or assisted living or whatever it is. We're only a half a degree away from all of that ourselves, or have
Yeah, but the real threat is that we'll see this as some sort of individual responsibility,
right,
rather than a responsibility as an organization to protect and sponsor and allow the workers to organize and struggle for what they need. And that's the threat. The liberals among us are going to want to say, oh, we should be doing something individually to support these workers. And yes, leave an extra tip to your person who's delivering your grocery if you want to, but you're not absolved at that moment. It's really this understanding as a group that we have to provide the political space and protection to allow them to organize and struggle for themselves with our help for what they need for their work life. That's the real threat, I think, at a moment like.
Yeah.
All right, we have one last question from Matt McDermott.
Actually, I really think this last bit of discussion really covered it. I mean, I was curious more about that interaction at the time of Living Wage and Build and Solidarity Sponsoring Committee about the clergy, kind of how bringing along the clergy and effective use of this Catholic social teaching in our organizing. Because I think I had a predecessor here in Connecticut who used it badly, right? Would tell lay Catholics what their church taught and what they ought to believe, in contrast to where they were on issues like immigration and whatnot. So I just think I'm just interested in those types of stories and examples, because I think there's a richness to this, but it's often not used well, I don't think, either in labor circles or community circles, to bring clergy or lay people along in a conversation and in a relationship that goes somewhere. I really appreciate the background and historical perspective you gave, Kathleen, at the beginning, because, in a lot of ways, this is a pretty radical statement. The Rerum Novarum too, and that maybe one last question to you or to others who know this history is, how much opposition did those encyclicals get at the time? You see Pope Francis now get a lot of pushback from the conservative wing of the church. Not to take it back to too churchy a discussion, but I'd be interested in that.
Well, I want to answer your first question first, and maybe leave to Leo and further discussions the historical question. I think the key thing about how we used these documents was as a starting point, and I was waiting for somebody to use that word radical, because when you look at what's in these documents, it is radical, but partly we used it to get the clergy in Build, not just to act, but to write their own stuff. I mean, we at every point had clergy in a way kind of doing their own theology around the work and the action of these campaigns. And they wrote kind of their own, reflections on work and reflections. We got them started by studying these things, but they were writing into that moment, whether it was the African-American clergy writing the Tent of Presence, or the Build clergy at various moments in Baltimore history, critiquing the economy of the city and applying their own, biblical and theological perspectives. So it's trying to get, to create out of this our own kind of radical, I use the word moral imagination. To me, that's what these documents are critical at, is agitating the moral imagination and the authority of people in the institutions, and then add to that what Jonathan is talking about, which is how do we organize, the folks, the subjects, who are at the center of this, this tension. And I think, as Adrian pointed out, yes, many of them, we are related to them. I've been struck in reading the Metro IAF, stuff from New York, is how many of these workers are in some of our congregations. So, they're inside us and around us. But how do we combine that with getting the church leaders, lay and clergy, to come up with their, our own moral imagination in the moment?
Yeah, this is a really unfair thing to do, Kathleen, right at the end of the conversation, but the radicalism is one side, but there's also an element where conservatism is really important in these things. Mm-hmm. And that is attachment to place, to the commitments to family, a sense of belonging, an appreciation of tradition. So in one sense, the way that radicalism has gone in the era of globalization is towards a very strong individual liberalism that wishes to liberate you from those bonds and from those attachments. So in a way, we need to be more radical, but also more conservative and have a sympathy. That's the position in the encyclicals anyway that I feel very strongly. Oh, it's nice to see you nodding. I thought that was maybe
amen to that.
Okay, great. Okay, brilliant. So on to next week.
On to next week.
Ben, did you want to say something real quick?
I just wanted to say, as I was struck by both Kathleen's and Jonathan's stories, and interestingly enough, even having spent the bulk of my career in the American labor movement, had similar experiences. 90+% of the workers and leaders of labor unions in the U.S. inherited their unions. They went to work in unionized workplaces and haven't experienced firsthand what it takes to organize a union and exercise your rights. And I've been in the battle for trying to create the resources and political space inside unions to do organizing of new workers. And so part of my takeaway from this is that if we're going to take these documents seriously and these teachings seriously, in some ways, because our erstwhile partners in labor aren't doing it, if we're serious about this, we have to think about what our opportunities and our obligations are in creating that space and those opportunities for workers if we're going to honor that.
Hey, Jonathan, one thing I just want to lift up is, this is Martin Trimble, the fundamental importance of recognition. The encyclical is recognition. And what Pope Francis wrote about popular movements and in 2015 is about recognition, and Build embracing workers who were unseen, who were pushed to the side, was about recognition. And I remember coming to a Build action, and that's what I felt, that people had dignity because they were being recognized. And then from that, hope and determination and fight that they already had in them was magnified, was multiplied. And, anyway, I just want to lift that up. I just think it's just fundamentally important.
Well, I think we can talk about it at future sessions. I think we need to wrap up today, but it wasn't just the recognition, Martin, although I think that was incredibly important. I agree with you. it was also the power bill creating the political space side of which these workers could become political themselves and stop being extensions of their tools and being fully human and be political themselves. And that was the most, you know, amazing part of the campaign, and true in London as well.
And Morris, connecting back to place, the first thing that those workers did with the increased wages they got was do things like plow it back into their communities. Those are great stories.
Every time I visited one whose first thing she did was fix up the porch on her East Baltimore house. First thing she did with her wages was to improve her community. Very first thing.
So maybe the opposite of radicalism is liberalism. Maybe.
Yeah. So you'll notice we haven't selected a reading for next week and a person to lead the discussion. There's going to be an evaluation immediately following this where that's going to be discussed. There's a couple different candidates. What that does is it makes it really important that if you want to receive that reading, you got to be on our list so Julie can send it to you. So if you're not, please put that on the chat or contact Julie directly, or add names of people you want added to that. It was great to have Father John with us, and I want to thank Bob for inviting him today. He's really interesting guy inside the Orthodox Church. So please add that. There's a couple candidates for reading next week. I want to thank everybody for giving up another hour of their week to doing this. I'm thoroughly enjoying it. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next week at the same time.
Everybody.
Be safe,
Thanks, Kathleen.
Bless
Thank
you all.
you, Kathleen. Thank you, Kathleen.